What a disgusting sound! It was the ringing of an alarm clock, which notified the whole room that it was 8 in the morning. With a sharp blow of his hand, the guy turned off the nasty ringing mechanism and slowly began to open his eyes. This is our hero. His name is Stanley, and he had a very bad headache. But not only because of the alarm clock, but because of something else. Rising from the bed, the guy said that no matter how important the client is, he shouldn't drink so much. No matter how much alcohol you pour into yourself, what's more important is the fact that you can make a deal or not. It is also worth remembering that you need to be able to work the next day. It is simply unbearable to go to work in such a serious condition. The hero got out of bed, put on his slippers and suddenly lowered his feet and heard the splash of water. Strange situation, why is the floor wet? Did Stanley forget to turn off the tap yesterday and flood his apartment? He decided to check if the faucet was leaking anywhere. After inspecting his apartment, the guy realized that the pipes were in order, the faucet was closed. Then where did so much water come from? Moreover, he lives on the top floor. There was no way they could flood it from above. He went to the window, stretched and thought that there was nothing valuable in his apartment anyway. First he should check the room, and the rest could be sorted out after Stanley returned from work. The hero took hold of the curtains and opened them wide to look at the morning sun and the weather outside the window. But what he saw outside the window shocked the guy. It seemed like some kind of bad dream. He saw a picture of huge waves covering the buildings and practically flooding all the floors. The sweat of fear flowed from his forehead. He did not understand what was happening and why there was so much water around. It seemed impossible. The entire city was flooded, as if a huge tsunami had swept through the area and plunged the once populated area underwater. Stanley immediately closed his eyes. He tried to rub them and thought that he really had too much yesterday. So all sorts of things were imagining. Opening his eyes slightly and not removing his hands, the guy looked at the terrible picture again. Nothing had changed. The elements were still raging outside the window, and nothing was visible except the ocean and the tops of buildings. The hero stepped back in horror. He realized that this was not a hallucination or a dream, and that everything was really happening. Now it's clear why the entire floor in the apartment is wet. But Stanley didn't understand how it was possible to get so drunk that he didn't notice how the whole city went underwater. The hero decided to check everything carefully. The first thing he did was leave his apartment in search of any survivors. "Is anyone home?" Stanley shouted as he reached the door of his neighbors, whom he knew well. The hero knocked more and more on the door, hoping that someone would open it and explain to him what had happened to the world. But no one answered him. Suddenly the door on which the guy was knocking opened by itself. Stanley immediately realized that apparently the door was not locked. Everything needed to be checked carefully. In the neighbor's apartment, the floor was also covered with water. There was no light, and leftover food, sneakers, and other clothes were floating around the apartment. Entering the house, Stanley realized that there was no one here. Even the dog had disappeared somewhere, the barking of which had once enraged the hero. He was still trying to understand what happened. Looking at the carelessly scattered food, the hero wondered why their city was covered by a flood. Putting all the pieces of the puzzle he saw in the apartment together, Stanley realized that the neighbors, as soon as they learned about what was happening, desperately rushed to run, knocking over the noodles, forgetting to put on their shoes and close the door behind them. He was seized by panic, and I, due to the fact that I slept soundly after drinking, was left here completely alone, while the rest left the building. But suddenly the hero looked at his hands, which he placed on the cabinet, and did not believe what he saw. His handprints remained on the cabinet. It couldn't be that if they ran away yesterday. Where could such a thick layer of dust come from here? How could food go bad so quickly? And in general, is even the most powerful flood capable of flooding an entire city in a miserable half-day? He left the apartment, and took out his phone to find any information about this. But there was no connection on the phone. Then the hero tried to call the rescue service, and then he was horrified the rescue service, which always answers, did not answer now. He lowered the phone. Everything was becoming too strange. A flooded city, dust as if people had not been here for a long time, and an unresponsive rescue service. Is our hero the only one left in this city? How is this even possible? But the exhausted guy came to his senses and resolutely clenched his fist. He had no idea what to do. But doing nothing was not his thing. He needed to figure out what was happening here and not lose heart. The elevator in the house did not work, and our hero lived on the top floor. so you can only use the stairs. But when he opened the door, the guy saw that the stairs to the lower floors were also flooded. Coming closer, he crouched down to look into the thickness of the water. Stanley was surprised that the water could even reach here. Reflecting on the flood, the hero touched the water, creating ripples on it that spread further and further. Suddenly his attention was attracted by the sound of water. A couple of meters away from him, the water began to boil, and it seemed that something was rising to the surface right now. Stanley was overcome with fear, sweat ran down his forehead, and goosebumps ran down his spine, but he continued to observe the unknown. Suddenly, something appeared from the water that scared the guy, and he abruptly moved away from the water and began to approach the exit from here. The unknown monster rose higher and higher. In appearance it seemed that it was the girl's hair, but it was quite possible that it was algae. The creature rose even higher and Stanley saw a face. It was a sweet girl with closed eyes. He continued to watch her when suddenly the seemingly dead girl began to open her mouth. From her mouth appeared ugly teeth and 4 tongues that seemed to want to tear her mouth from the inside. Stanley was terrified. The situation was becoming more and more terrible with each passing second. The girl completely floated to the surface, and she really was dead. But her body was somehow strange. If you don't look at the strange tongues, strange petals similar to meat were also sticking out of her chest. The guy's pulse quickened, panic gripped his body, when suddenly he realized that it was a girl who lived on the 29th floor. Now the guy was on the 30th floor. He continued to look at the corpse. Despite all the horror, you need to assess the situation in order to understand at least something about what is happening here. He visually examined her body. The corpse was bloated and someone had gnawed her arm. Could it be some kind of fish? What if these are not fish, but something much worse? Stanley's imagination ran wild. But he had every reason to think that most likely these were not fish. After all, something else was floating on the lower floors right now and watching the hero, an unknown black substance that was not visible in the water column. There was no point in staying any longer. He needed to collect everything he needed to survive. Stanley returned to the house and the first thing he did was collect food. Next, you need to arm yourself with something in case of an attack. The guy took tools from the table that would be useful as weapons and a large cleaver. You also need to stock up on things. Warm clothes so as not to freeze because who knows what will happen next. And the last thing our survivor needs are sources of fire, matches, a lighter, any paper in the form of notebooks and old books. Stanley decided that he needed to imagine that he was stranded on a desert island with a limited supply of things. As for the escape plan, the hero had a couple of ideas on how to escape from here. Alternatively, you can stay here and wait for rescue, climb onto the roof and set fire to some rubbish in order to give a signal using smoke. At the same time you need to walk around the neighbors and see if they have any supplies, and then how lucky the hero will either be saved or everything will finally go underwater. Another option is to make yourself a raft. When Stanley uses up 70% of his supplies, he will have no choice but to take the risk and try to get out of here on a raft in search of salvation. To begin with, he decided to choose the first option and make a fire on the roof. Suddenly there are helicopters flying here looking for survivors. There is still a chance of salvation. Having collected several books and textbooks, the guy opened the door leaving his apartment. He was heading to the roof. Now all he could do was trust fate. But suddenly he saw a terrible picture in front of him. In the corridor filled with water, there were someone's footprints that went further down the corridor. The guy panicked again. Maybe I'm not the only survivor. Someone climbed the stairs and entered the couple's apartment. But how did he get here if the stairs are flooded? There were too many questions, but the answers could only be found by checking who entered the apartment. Stanley armed himself with a cleaver and a hammer and decided to do it. Approaching the door of his neighbors, he asked if anyone was alive here. But still no one answered him. The apartment still seemed empty and lifeless. But Stanley understood that someone was here. His legs didn't move. He needed to check who was inside. But fear gripped his body. Besides, if it was a person, then why didn't he answer him? Or maybe it's someone else. Suddenly the hero heard the splash of water and saw a terrible foot that appeared from around the corner of the room. Then the hero saw a mutilated woman who had already become undead and there was nothing human left of her. The picture was like in real horror films. All the guy's fears were confirmed and he was no longer a person. As soon as he realized that things were bad, the monster immediately began to move towards the guy. The wild creature jumped on the stunned Stanley, who froze in place from his panic fear. The zombie knocked the guy to the ground and reached out to bite him and feast on fresh flesh. But the hero did not give up. He kept the monster at a distance, not allowing it to bite him. But the zombie continued his attempts to bite the hero. Up close he seemed even more terrible than from a distance, because one bite and Stanley would be finished. Suddenly the hero overcame his fear and, shouting, decided to fight for his life to the end. He sharply kicked the terrible monster and threw it off him. The monster flew a couple of meters away from the guy. But upon landing, the zombie immediately made a push in order to attack again. One quick movement, and he was already flying towards Stanley, trying to knock down his victim again. But this time the hero prepared to attack. He took a fighting stance to counterattack. As soon as the monster approached the hero, he immediately hit him on the head with a hammer. The blow was powerful, from which the monster immediately died, and the guy still recovered from the adrenaline in his body for a few seconds. Trying to catch his breath, Stanley realized that zombies had appeared in the world. Is it possible that this mutation was caused by the flood? Suddenly the monster glowed with a blue radiance, as if dissolving into thin air. This surprised the guy. Suddenly he heard a system alert, which told him that the source of the spirit had been increased. He had collected 1 source out of 5. The source of the spirit is one of the 5. What does this mean? What other source of spirit? Suddenly he felt himself covered by a strange blue aura that had just emanated from the monster. His body seemed to begin to charge and evolve, emitting blue sparks and concentrating power in the center of the guy's abdomen. When it ended, Stanley felt as if something had been absorbed into him. Had he really earned a unit of this source by killing that zombie? Apparently this evolution has an effect on my body. The place where I was bruised no longer hurts. Fatigue has disappeared and I seem to feel a kind of surge of energy. The hero swung the hammer, and it seemed to him that even his strength increased, and he became much more powerful. But we must not forget about the monster. The guy lowered his gaze and looked at him. He thought what to do with this corpse. We need to get rid of him. Maybe he can come to life or some other tricks. So the hero took the dead creature by the leg. He slowly walked towards the stairs, dragging the corpse behind him. While Stanley walked along the corridor, he thought that this world had changed forever. The evil dead and this mysterious source of the spirit. From the point of view of common sense, it is definitely not possible to explain what is happening. Who knows, the changes that happened to that woman were accidental or inevitable. If all the corpses are like her, then the city has turned into an extremely dangerous place. It was difficult to imagine how many people died in this flood. Perhaps the death toll was over 1 million people. Stanley was sure that there was no smell of safety here. He needed to get to the rescuers as soon as possible and get out of here. A few hours later, the hero climbed to the roof. He collected a bunch of unnecessary rubbish in order to carry out his first plan. But before doing this, he looked from the roof of the house at the vast water. How large the flood must be for the consequences to be so terrifying. The neighboring building also had 30 floors. The hero wondered if there were survivors there like him. Either way, Stanley figured he'd find out soon enough. He began to make a fire. Old books and notebooks burned well, and the flames became larger and larger with each piece of paper. As a result, the guy created a huge fire, the flames of which rose higher than the height of the guy himself. If there are survivors nearby, they may react when they see thick smoke rising from the roof of his house. Black smoke went further into the sky. It was visible in the area of several kilometers. Some time passed, and all that remained from the huge fire were the coals of burning books. Stanley, who was watching this, was upset that in half an hour no one had come to his aid. Apparently there was no need to count on rescuers. Going down the stairs to the apartment, the hero thought that his food supplies would be enough for 4 days. When suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by a shocking sight. He saw the water that touched his feet. Stanley clearly remembered that when he first came here it did not reach the 30th floor. So why was the entire span flooded now? Is the water level continuing to rise? This means only one thing: staying on the 30th floor is also unsafe. So you need to quickly build a raft because no one knows what fate will have in store for him next. The hero returned to his apartment. He worked hard to create a raft to get out of here as quickly as possible. Made from several door frames, a bed frame and a couple of drawers, it should be able to withstand up to 300 kilograms. Fortunately, in his student years, Stanley participated in boat races. The guy knew that if he made an oar, he would be able to swim to the next building. After rummaging around in the closet for a while, he found a clothes hanger that worked well as a paddle. But when he came out of the closet, the guy again saw a frightening thing. A zombie corpse was floating right outside the window, which showed no signs of life. But no one knows whether he is actually alive or dead. Stanley suggested that it might be that not all people turn into zombies. But what if this man could still be saved? While the water level allows, the hero decided to take this opportunity and test the theory. Attaching the hammer to his hanger, Stanley opened the window, behind which a body was floating. Carefully, the hero decided to pull the man towards him and extended his oar to him. When suddenly the monster woke up and growled, looking with its red eyes at the frightened guy. Stanley realized that he had screwed up. He needed to try to do something so that the zombie did not kill him, and the hero decided to hit him with his oar. He tried to poke the monster's head when suddenly the zombie began to go under the water. What was it? Why did he suddenly begin to go underwater? Each time Stanley's guesses frightened him more and more. The zombie was dangling in the water, as if resisting an unknown force that was trying to drag him away. But the monster was weaker. After a few seconds, only the creature's legs were visible on the surface of the water. Then he completely plunged under the water into the arms of an unknown creature, which was most likely even more dangerous than these dead men. What he saw horrified Stanley. He also realized that besides zombies there was someone more terrible, someone who stood at the next step in the food chain of this world. He immediately closed the window. The guy didn't want to face this monster. Stanley was breathing heavily, trying to recover from his panic state. Something urgently needed to be done. Suddenly the hero remembered that the corpse of that woman also had signs of being eaten. Perhaps it was the same monster. Stanley slowly slid down the wall and sat down in the water. He had been working so hard on the raft, thinking of a way to get out of here as quickly as possible. But the appearance of these two discouraged him from trying. But staying here is also not an option. There is enough food for a maximum of 4 days, not to mention the fact that the water is rising inexorably, and also these undead. Suddenly he heard a roar and loud slams of hands on the door. Stanley immediately jumped up and grabbed the hammer. As soon as he remembered the undead, they immediately appeared. The hero slowly approached the door and looked through the peephole to see who was behind the door. He saw another mindless dead man knocking on the door in search of food. In addition, the monster had a broken leg, but the hero was not sure whether this would affect his speed of movement. But deciding that this zombie would get to him anyway, sooner or later, Stanley decided to attack him first. Opening the door sharply and taking advantage of the fact that the zombie's back was standing, the hero swung his hammer to break his skull. Hearing the noise, the terrible zombie immediately turned around and saw the hero flying towards him. But it was too late. Stanley's guess was correct, and he was too slow to dodge the attack. Another enemy was defeated. This time everything went much more smoothly than last time. A system window suddenly appeared above the guy's head. The same unknown system reported that the source of the spirit has been increased and is now 2 points out of 5. Stanley smiled. It seemed he understood how the system worked, and now he should receive energy, just like last time. And yes, everything worked out like last time. The hero was covered in blue energy and felt his strength increase again. In other words, by killing zombies and increasing the value of the source of the spirit, Stanley becomes stronger, since his abilities increase, and there is hope of confronting the creatures hiding in the water and getting out of here. It remains to be understood what this inscription means. 2 sources out of 5. Now the hero only has 2. But what will happen when he collects 5? Suddenly, his thoughts were interrupted by a growl that came from behind him. Such a sharp sound sent a shiver through the guy's body. He turned around and immediately remembered the window in the bedroom leading to the street. Turning around, Stanley saw a zombie who opened the window and climbed inside his apartment. The ugly smile and rage-filled eyes did not bode well. Another difficult battle lay ahead. Stanley understood how the monster got here, and besides, this creature was clearly superior in strength to those he had met before. But the guy had no choice. In any case, he had to kill him. After these words, the hero went on the attack. The monstrous zombie also rushed towards the guy, wanting to feast on his body. Suddenly, the monster grabbed Stanley's arm and stopped his attack. Realizing the situation in which he found himself, the guy thought that this monster was much stronger and more agile than those that came before him. If I had not received the second source of spirit, my strength would not have increased. I am afraid that in that case I would not have the slightest chance of winning. It was necessary to get out of this situation, and Stanley figured out how. He raised his leg. The guy then punched the zombie in the stomach to push it away and free his hand with the hammer. The hero thought that the blow was strong, but the monster did not move at all, and it seemed that he did not feel anything at all. Stanley realized this too. He realized that this improved monster was not afraid of pain. At that same second, the monster grabbed the guy by the leg and threw him away. Stanley flew a couple of meters and landed in a pile of rubbish, clattering with everything he could. The blow was strong. The guy tried to catch his breath under the rubble of a tree and a pile of clothes into which he fell. Breathing was disrupted. Stanley felt severe pain in his chest. He assumed that he had broken his ribs during the fall. But his thoughts were interrupted by a zombie who was approaching the guy. Will Stanley really die just like that? The monster was drawn to the guy. He was driven by the animal thirst for hunger that accompanied the creatures in this global flood. But Stanley was not going to give up. He shouted that by any means he must stay alive. As soon as the monster came closer, the guy immediately grabbed a piece of clothing lying on the floor. Then he pulled it towards himself, and the zombie, who was trapped, lost his balance and fell on his back. The monster was stunned by this turn of events, but he could not do anything. Taking advantage of the moment, Stanley immediately rushed at the creature. Die, the guy shouted. Then, with a powerful blow of a hammer, he hit the zombie on the head, knocking out the last remnants of his mind. The zombie's eyes turned white. He landed on his back and no longer showed signs of life. Covered in the sweat of fear, Stanley breathed greedily, trying to catch his breath. His ribs still hurt, but the worst was over. A mysterious system again appeared above his head, which notified the guy that he had received a new spirit source point. Blue energy began to gather in the guy's body again, and he realized that this source of spirit had some kind of healing power. The rib no longer hurt, and the pain went away. Hearing a rustling behind him, the hero thought that if not for this force, he would definitely have died here a long time ago. After all, right now 2 more zombies crawled into his room. Having heard the roar when the guy was falling, if the rib had been broken, he would definitely have come to an end. The enraged monsters rushed at Stanley with a scream. Their faces were as disfigured as those of their previous brothers, with crooked teeth and eyes filled with rage. Since the hero became stronger, he immediately hit the first enemy on the head with a hammer. But due to the large swing, he did not have time to return to his original stance. The zombie took advantage of this and grabbed the guy by the hand. He held Stanley's hand and pushed further, trying to get to his head. But fortunately for the guy, this was not the hand in which he was holding the hammer, so the hero immediately raised it above the creature's head. There was a blow, and the last thing the zombie heard in his remaining consciousness was the ringing in his ears. The monster's body immediately froze and the immobilized creature fell on its back. 2 more opponents were defeated. Lucky that they were stupid and not as strong as the monster before them. The system that appeared notified the hero that the task had been successfully completed. Now the hero is the owner of the first level spirit source, and to move to the next level he needs 10 points. A powerful force filled his body. With each monster he killed, Stanley felt how he was evolving. The system told the hero that there were 2 evolutionary paths available to him, the stomach and the lungs. Stanley began to consider his choice. He assumed that in this flooded world, increased lung capacity would be a distinct advantage. So he chose the lungs, and at that moment his body vibrated. The system window that appeared said that it was starting to improve the lungs. The hero would receive strong lungs of the first type. A blue ball with unknown energy appeared at chest level, and together with pain, it penetrated deep into the hero. Blue energy, like little worms, found the lungs and began to penetrate inside them. At one moment, the guy's lungs shrank and vibrated. Additional growths appeared in it. The evolution was completed. Exhaling, Stanley really felt that the volume of his lungs had increased compared to what it was before. Now he could hold his breath for at least 3 minutes. Now the guy has hope again. He just needs to pump up this system, so he can survive in this world. And besides, the system talked about 10 more points, and apparently if the guy got them, he could get another evolution and increase his chances of survival. Looking at the broken window, Stanley realized that this room was no longer suitable for living. Fortunately, the adjacent room was open. You can spend the night there. He picked up the sheet from the floor to use it as a blanket for sleeping. The hero decided that after the next improvement, he would definitely get out of here. Suddenly there was a splash of water, as if something had fallen into it. Stanley was sinking deep to the bottom of the impenetrable abyss. Something was pulling him down. His eyes were closed, and suddenly in his head he heard a voice that told him that he must become stronger. The hero did not understand what was happening. Was he really drowning, and what voice was speaking to him? Sinking to the bottom, the hero had not yet seen how a huge human hand appeared under him. Sinking lower and lower, Stanley suddenly felt solid support, and he realized that he could now stand up. He landed right on this huge hand, and turning around he saw an even more terrible thing. At the bottom of the sea in front of him stood an unknown huge figure of a man in a hood who was holding a guy on his arm. A man of colossal size repeated to the hero that he must become stronger. Suddenly the hand began to move upward, and Stanley, having difficulty maintaining his balance, asked the creature who he was. The mysterious man brought the guy closer to him, and said that he was waiting for him here. 3 minutes passed, and the hero felt himself beginning to suffocate under the water. He was about to drown. Stanley suddenly opened his eyes. The mysterious man and the deep sea disappeared. He got up in the same room, covered with a blanket, breathing heavily. Stanley grabbed his chest and realized that it was just a dream. But suddenly the guy saw in front of him how the room became dark, as if someone's shadow was covering the window behind the guy. The hero slowly turned around to see what was covering the sun. What he saw was much worse than the past zombies and the frightening sea. A huge monster, unlike people, with a large red eye in the center of its body, looked at the guy from outside the window. He emerged from the water and looked like a large mushroom with blisters, one red eye and a long tongue. Stanley grabbed the hammer. Maybe this is the monster that gnawed the corpse. It seems my only chance to get out of here alive is to kill him. But the guy wasn't completely sure of his victory. The best option would be to wait, get a couple of sources of spirit, get stronger, and then lure him out and finish him off. But the monster didn't think so. The crack of glass that Stanley heard seriously frightened him. An unknown creature was banging its head against the window, trying to break it and devour the guy. Stanley realized that things were bad. He needed to urgently come up with something. He squeezed his hammer tighter in his hand, preparing for an attack. But suddenly a frog-like monster jumped from the window and dived back into the water. Then he emerged. Stanley realized what the monster was trying to do. He dives and jumps out, hitting the window, creating powerful shocks and gradually breaking through it. Therefore, the guy ran to the glass trying to hold it, and the monster jumped again and hit his head on the window. He was too close to the creature. Fear overcame him, and the guy understood that the glass would not hold up for long. Looking closer at the monster, the guy suddenly noticed a green source of spirit in it. The monster again disappeared into the depths of the sea, causing the hero to panic more and more. Suddenly he appeared and stuck out his huge tongue with a green ball at the end. This time the monster managed to break through the glass, and with his head he practically reached Stanley. The guy realized that the mutant's power was too great, and he couldn't cope with him. But he had no choice but to try to attack him. The hero swung his hammer and shouted to the monster, "Get away." The monster stuck in the window stuck out its long tongue and tried to grab the guy, like a toad trying to catch a fly. With a powerful blow of his tongue, the monster nailed the guy to the wall. This time he won't get away with just a broken rib. Then the monster broke through the window frame and tried to climb completely into the apartment. Having difficulty rising from the floor, Stanley saw a terrible monster in front of him. At that moment the guy realized that he was no match for this frog. But the desire to survive was still stronger, so the hero did not come up with anything better than to grab onto the nearby table. Lifting the table with his new strength, he threw it towards his enemy. But such an object was not a hindrance for the mutant, so he easily fought it off with his paw. Turning to the guy, he suddenly noticed that the place where the hero had just been was empty, and he had disappeared somewhere. Meanwhile, Stanley took advantage of the moment and ran into the bathroom, hoping for the cramped space of the room. As if in horror films, the hero stood behind the wall and breathed very slowly. His heart was pounding, and he realized that right now an angry frog was looking for him in the apartment. Smelling its prey, the monster jumped sharply and broke through the wall in the bathroom trying to catch the guy. But suddenly the monster felt that he was stuck. The guy couldn't hesitate and needed to use this advantage right now. So he waved his cleaver and shouted that he would have to pay with his life for breaking into private property. The guy's cleaver crashed right into the monster's eye with great speed. The enraged animal screamed from the hellish pain it felt. Its eye was bleeding, spattering the entire bathtub with blood. After a few minutes, the frog stopped convulsing and became silent. Stanley noticed that its eye color had changed. Apparently it was finished with it. But just in case, you need to make sure that this creature is dead, so the hero, with overwhelming rage, dealt several more blows with a cleaver to the creature's head. After a few blows, the guy sat on the floor and took a breath. It was dangerous. If he had made even one mistake, he would have said goodbye to his life. Suddenly a system message appeared above his head, and for killing this frog the guy received as many as 8 spirit source points. Now the moment of absorption had come. Before that he absorbed 1 point at a time, but now 8 at once. The hero could hardly restrain the energy that was flowing to him, but he was able to successfully absorb it all. The hero looked at his hands, which glowed with a blue radiance. He realized that his strength had increased again, and now it would be much easier to kill this frog. Suddenly the hero noticed how some strange blue sphere was trying to crawl out of the frog's eye. Suddenly this sphere was released and quickly flew towards the guy like a golf ball. Stanley was scared. What is this all about? But the ball flew straight at his forehead. The guy did not have time to react and dodge, and a blue ball from the frog's body crashed into his forehead and made its way inside his head. The hero touched the blue glow in his forehead and tried to understand what it was. Was this eye also the source of the spirit? Although he didn't look like him. The system reported that the guy received an incomplete peeping rune. His ability makes it possible to spy on spiritual beasts and obtain basic information about them, and can also evolve to a third eye with unknown abilities. Stanley was happy, even though he had to take risks. But it was worth it. He received not only a source of spirit, but also a new ability. According to the system, the rune can be used to obtain information about spiritual beasts. This frog must be such a beast. The guy focused his gaze on the frog and summoned a peeping rune, and at that moment a blue symbol appeared on his forehead. The rune said that this is a Cyclops Frog. It is part of the elite group of first-level spiritual beasts. It feeds on lower corpse animals. The cruel temperament. Having noticed the prey will never retreat, it can evolve into the Cyclops Frog King. There is a high probability of obtaining a special skill peeping rune for its murder. Having received the information, Stanley realized that this frog turns out to be an elite monster. But what is the mechanism for increasing the skill of this monster? With each new hour, information about this world amazed the guy. At first it was unclear where the flood had come from and destroyed the city. Then the appearance of mutated undead, which is also unclear where it came from and how people turn into zombies in general. A mysterious system that makes the hero stronger for killing every creature and allows his body to evolve. There are incredible changes going on in the world right now, and what was once called common sense no longer has any meaning. Continuing to think about the future, the hero went to the window. He thought that life and death are not toys. Therefore, in any case, he must get out and find out what is happening outside now. The third day of the flood arrived. The water rose higher and higher, and the end of the sea was not visible over the horizon. Holding the hammer tightly in his hands, Stanley said that the rules of this world have changed, and now he needs to get more sources of spirit. He walked up to the door behind which he heard a grinding sound and sharply knocked it down, throwing away the zombie who was standing behind it. This was no longer the same fearful guy. Stanley firmly knew that only by adapting to new conditions could he survive. He entered the very room where the Cyclops Frog was killed and saw several zombies greedily devouring it. The guy focused his vision and summoned a peeping rune to assess the situation. The rune reported that in front of him there were walking corpses of the lowest rank. They have a certain probability of evolving, devouring their own kind. Stanley prepared his cleaver for the attack. These zombies appeared here just in time because he needs to get 2 more sources of spirit to collect all 10 and become stronger. After these words, the hero sharply pushed off the floor and ran towards the opponents. He was fast as lightning. The system made him stronger, and the first zombies were defeated. The sign above the guy's head said that he had become a first-level medium, and had collected 10 spirit source points out of 10. Stanley was glad that he managed to do this. Now he will receive the long-awaited improvement. The guy chose the option responsible for the beginning of evolution, and his body began to be covered with a blue aura. Soon the system reported that the improvement was completed. In order to become a second-level medium, one would need to collect 20 sources of spirit. Now the hero can strengthen the lungs of the first type, stomach, and his muscles. Stanley analyzed what would be best to take. With enhanced lungs I would be able to hold my breath for at least 4 minutes. However, In the water I could encounter something damn terrible and they would be of no use. So the best option would be to strengthen your muscles by making your choice and hitting the window of the system with a hammer. The system reported that Stanley receives basic strengthening, type 1 muscle mass gain, muscle strengthening, strength increases, muscle control improves, and muscle strength increases. He felt the power of the system penetrate his body. It was a painful process, just like then with the lungs. At that same second, the guy felt his arms, legs and torso begin to swell and expand, his muscles strengthened, and he began to look like an athlete. Now Stanley felt much better, more powerful and faster. This feeling amazed him. Due to the large volumes of muscles, the clothes on his body were torn. Now his strength has increased significantly. Just like his ability to control his own body, he felt every muscle in his body. Now he can use this skill for defense. It's time to try it out, Stanley said and threw the hammer into the air. Firmly grabbing the hammer that had fallen into his hand, the guy prepared to attack his first target, who was already running towards him. One blow and the zombie's face was deformed and all its teeth flew out. The hero was surprised how far the monster flew, and even so he could barely calculate his strength and could hardly stand on his feet. But this power pleased him. He understood that he was now capable of more than before. Stanley began to cut up the monsters that were in the room. The lower zombies were quite stupid and it was not difficult. Little by little he began to get used to the force of the blow, concentrated it on his legs and arms, and each time it became easier to control his body. The monsters could not oppose him, and after each blow to the guy's head with his small hammer, they died. The last zombie fell dead at the guy's feet. All opponents were defeated. Stanley looked at his goals and rejoiced at the power he had gained. The evolution test was successful. However, there was one detail that seemed strange. The system window did not appear, which meant that for the first time he did not receive a spirit source for these creatures. Stanley exhaled and said, "Oh well, the level of these creatures is not high enough anyway." Apparently that was the problem. Fortunately, I have a second-level spirit source, so it's time to step out of the shadows and stop hoping for something. Today I'll build a raft and get out of here. A few hours later, the homemade visor sank into the water. The hero collected all his things that were left and headed towards the neighboring house. The guy completed his raft and could now move on water. He took with him several sources of fire, the remaining food and clothing. Swimming up to the neighboring house, Stanley thought that this distance of a couple of tens of meters was seriously scary. He wrapped a rope around a brick in case he missed and threw it out the window of the house. But there was no need to get it out. The hero successfully knocked out the window with the first hit of a brick. Armed with the usual weapon in case of attack, he approached the window, because no one knows what awaits him inside. Looking out the window and assessing the situation, Stanley realized that there seemed to be no danger in this room. He climbed through the window and made his way inside the apartment, splashing water. Running his hand over the table, the hero noticed that there was the same thick layer of dust here as his neighbors. Apparently no one had cleaned up here for a long time. Having prepared his hammer, he gradually began to make his way deeper into the house. There could be danger around every corner, so Stanley carefully and slowly opened the door. But it seemed that no one had lived here for a long time, because the smell was musty, and there was not a single sound. The first step is to get supplies. The guy opened the refrigerator door, but, unfortunately, all the food had long since gone rotten. Looking deep into the refrigerator, Stanley hoped that people still managed to get out alive. Suddenly he felt the smell of blood coming from the next door. Apparently there are zombies there. But in any case, we need to check the room. So Stanley moved closer to the scary door. The hero sharply opened the door and prepared to attack. But no one attacked him. After all the zombies that were behind this door were dead, which was quite strange. Stanley realized that all the people turned into the Walking Dead, but were then killed. But who could have done this? Perhaps there are survivors like him hiding here somewhere. Therefore, just in case, the hero decided to check the room using a peeping rune. Passing by, he only saw a sign that wrote that the creatures were dead. Stanley thought that since this man managed to overcome so many dead people, he must also be the bearer of the source of the spirit. But the guy was not sure whether this man was here. Having reached the nearest door, Stanley began knocking on it and shouting if anyone was alive. Suddenly looking around, the hero saw something that the system highlighted for him. On the floor near the door there was a key that possibly fits it. The guy picked it up from the floor and inserted it into the keyhole. He noticed that the key was the same as his from a past life, which seemed to be a long time ago. The key came up and Stanley opened the door. Entering the room, he saw a man on the floor who did not look like the zombies that he had met before. Looking at the bat that the man was holding, he assumed that with its help the man dealt with all the undead in the previous room. After scanning the man, the system said that he was not a walking corpse like the previous bodies that the guy had seen. But it seems a stronger monster appeared here, like that giant frog, and tore him apart with its sharp claws. Perhaps if Stanley had arrived earlier he would have managed to save him. In any case, the past cannot be returned. The guy decided to inherit the weapon with which the man fought. Suddenly, a rune on his forehead reacted, saying that there was someone else in this room. He heard rustling in the closet. Stanley immediately went to him to check what was there. There could be anything there. Perhaps the same monster that killed the man was sitting in it. So the hero carefully began to open the closet door, holding the bat at the ready. Cold sweat appeared on his forehead. Fear paralyzed him. The hero swallowed the lump in his throat, but he needed to check what was inside. There was no choice. The guy sharply pulled the cabinet handle and raised his bat. But what he saw shocked him. In the corner of the closet, under some clothes, sat a little girl, who looked at the hero in disbelief.